Imagine trying to fall asleep when it's 20 degrees below zero. No heated shelter, no warm bed, just frozen mud beneath you and enemy artillery in the distance. For millions of World War II soldiers on the Eastern Front, in the Battle of the Bulge, and in the mountains of Italy, this wasn't a camping trip gone wrong. This was survival. Winter warfare pushed the human body beyond what most people thought possible. Soldiers had to sleep in conditions that would kill an unprepared person in hours. Frostbite could take your fingers. Hypothermia could take your life. Yet somehow, they found ways to rest, recover, and fight another day. The techniques they developed weren't just clever tricks. They were life-or-death knowledge passed down from veteran to rookie, tested in some of the harshest conditions humans have ever faced in combat. When temperatures dropped to -40 degrees Fahrenheit during the siege of Leningrad, when American GIs found themselves trapped in the Ardennes forest during the coldest winter in decades, when British troops faced alpine conditions in the Italian mountains, soldiers had to become experts in cold weather survival or they simply wouldn't see the next dawn. The Eastern Front was perhaps the most brutal testing ground for these survival techniques. The German Wehrmacht, unprepared for the Russian winter, watched entire divisions become combat ineffective not from enemy fire, but from cold injuries. Soviet forces, better equipped for winter warfare, still lost hundreds of thousands of men to the cold. American forces in the Battle of the Bulge faced similar challenges when Hitler's surprise offensive caught Allied troops in the middle of one of Europe's harshest winters. These weren't professional mountaineers or Arctic explorers. These were farm boys from Texas, factory workers from Detroit, clerks from London, and students from Moscow. Most had never experienced temperatures below freezing for extended periods, let alone tried to sleep outdoors in sub-zero conditions while under enemy fire. They had to learn fast, or they died. The knowledge they developed came at a terrible cost. For every technique that worked, dozens of soldiers paid the price during the learning process. Entire units would lose men to cold injuries before they figured out what worked and what didn't. The survivors became teachers, passing on hard-earned wisdom to replacement troops who arrived with little understanding of what winter combat really meant. Medical officers documented thousands of cases of cold injuries, from minor frostbite to complete hypothermic collapse. They tracked which units maintained combat effectiveness and which ones fell apart in the cold. The patterns became clear. Units that developed systematic approaches to cold weather survival maintained their fighting strength. Units that relied on individual toughness or ignored the threat lost combat effectiveness within days. The challenge wasn't just surviving one cold night. It was surviving weeks and months of winter warfare, where every night brought the same life-threatening conditions. Soldiers had to maintain their energy for combat during the day while recovering from near hypothermic conditions each morning. They had to keep their weapons functional, their equipment operational, and their minds sharp, all while their bodies were constantly under assault from the cold. What made it even more dangerous was the gradual nature of cold injury. Unlike a bullet wound or shrapnel, hypothermia and frostbite crept up slowly. A soldier might not realize he was in danger until it was too late. By the time symptoms became obvious, permanent damage was often already done. This meant that survival techniques had to focus on prevention rather than treatment. The psychological challenge was just as brutal as the physical one. Sleeping in conditions where you might not wake up created a constant state of stress that wore down even the toughest soldiers. The knowledge that your survival depended on techniques that might or might not work, that one mistake in preparation could cost you your fingers or your life, created a mental burden that added to the already overwhelming stress of combat. Yet somehow, millions of soldiers learned to adapt. They developed systems that worked. They created knowledge that saved lives. The techniques they pioneered weren't written in any manual. They were discovered through trial and error, shared through whispered conversations in frozen foxholes, and refined through months of desperate experimentation. These methods would prove that humans could survive in conditions that seemed impossible. They showed that with the right knowledge, the right preparation, and the right teamwork, soldiers could sleep in frozen trenches and wake up ready to fight. But first, they had to understand exactly what they were up against. Sleeping in a frozen trench isn't like camping in cold weather. It's warfare, which means you can't build a big fire that might give away your position to enemy observers or artillery spotters. You can't set up a proper tent that could be spotted from aircraft or provide a clear target for snipers. And you definitely can't abandon your post to find warmer shelter, even if such shelter existed anywhere within miles of the front lines. The ground itself becomes your primary enemy in winter warfare. Frozen Earth doesn't just feel cold. It actively steals body heat through a process called conductive heat loss. When human skin makes contact with frozen ground, heat transfers from the warm body to the cold surface at a rate that can drop core body temperature by several degrees in just minutes. Soldiers learned quickly that sleeping directly on frozen ground was essentially a slow form of suicide. Even with a thick winter coat, your body heat would drain through the frozen mud faster than your metabolism could replace it, sending your core temperature plummeting toward the danger zone, where hypothermia begins to shut down vital organs. The construction of trenches made the cold even more deadly. These defensive positions were designed to protect soldiers from enemy fire, not from weather. They were dug into the ground, creating long, narrow ditches that acted like natural refrigerators. Cold air, being denser than warm air, would settle into these low areas and stay there, creating pockets of supercooled air that could be 10 or 15 degrees colder than the surrounding area. A soldier sleeping in a trench might face temperatures significantly lower than weather reports indicated, and this cold air had nowhere to go. Wind presented another constant threat that could turn an uncomfortable night into a lethal one. Even a slight breeze could create wind chill that dramatically increased the rate of heat loss from exposed skin. More dangerous was the way wind could penetrate through any gaps in clothing, shelter, or defensive positions. Cold air moving across wet or damp clothing could cause rapid cooling that led to hypothermia in less than an hour. Soldiers had to become experts at identifying and blocking even the smallest air leaks that could compromise their survival. Moisture was perhaps the most underestimated killer in winter warfare. Soldiers would sweat during daytime combat operations, and this moisture would remain trapped in their clothing as temperatures dropped at night. Wet clothing loses its insulating properties and actually accelerates heat loss by conducting warmth away from the body. Snow that melted during the day would refreeze at night, creating ice directly against soldiers' skin. Even breath condensation could freeze inside sleeping areas, creating ice buildup that made conditions progressively worse throughout the night. The standard military equipment of World War II was designed for mobility and durability, not extreme cold weather protection. Most armies entered the war with wool blankets that were intended for temperate climates. These blankets were thin, designed to balance warmth with weight considerations since soldiers had to carry everything they owned. A typical army blanket provided minimal insulation and offered no protection against wind or moisture. When wet, wool blankets became heavy, took days to dry, and lost much of their insulating capacity. Uniform design created additional challenges. Military clothing was cut for ease of movement and durability under combat conditions, not for maximum warmth retention. Gaps at the wrists, ankles, and neck allowed cold air to penetrate and circulate inside clothing. Most uniforms lacked proper layering systems, forcing soldiers to choose between freedom of movement during combat and warmth during rest periods. The weight restrictions imposed by combat operations meant that soldiers had to make constant trade-offs between survival gear and mission-essential equipment. Every pound devoted to extra blankets or insulation was a pound that couldn't be used for ammunition, food, medical supplies, or communications equipment. A soldier might have to choose between carrying enough ammunition for the next day's battle or enough insulation to survive the night, knowing that either choice could prove fatal. Sleep deprivation compounded all these physical challenges. Soldiers who were already exhausted from combat operations were more susceptible to hypothermia because their bodies had fewer energy reserves to maintain core temperature. Fatigue also impaired judgment, making it harder to recognize the early warning signs of cold injury or to properly execute survival techniques that required careful attention to detail. The tactical situation made everything worse. Soldiers couldn't move around freely to generate body heat because movement might expose their positions to enemy observation. They couldn't create noise that might mask the sound of approaching enemy forces. They had to remain ready for instant action, which meant sleeping in full gear with weapons immediately accessible, adding weight and bulk that interfered with insulation techniques. Medical support was often hours or days away, meaning that soldiers had to prevent cold injuries rather than treat them. Once frostbite or serious hypothermia set in, field treatment options were extremely limited. A soldier who suffered cold injury might become a permanent casualty, unable to continue fighting and requiring evacuation that put additional strain on already stretched medical resources. Soldiers developed a sophisticated system of layering that went far beyond simply putting on extra clothes. They learned that effective insulation required creating multiple trapped air spaces between their skin and the outside environment. The key wasn't necessarily having the thickest or warmest clothing, but understanding how to use whatever materials were available to create these crucial air pockets. Veterans would teach newcomers to think of their body as a heat source that needed to be carefully managed and conserved, not wasted through poor layering techniques. The base layer closest to skin had to remain dry at all costs. Soldiers learned to change their innermost clothing before settling in for the night, even if it meant stripping down in freezing temperatures for a few minutes. Dry undergarments were so critical that experienced soldiers would often carry an extra set specifically for sleeping, keeping them inside their jackets during the day to ensure they stayed warm and moisture-free. This practice meant sacrificing precious carrying capacity, but veterans knew that starting the night with dry clothing against their skin could mean the difference between waking up refreshed or waking up with frostbite. Middle layers became an exercise in creative scavenging and improvisation. Soldiers would stuff newspaper, letters from home, captured enemy documents, or any paper materials they could find between layers of clothing. Paper created excellent insulation when kept dry, and it weighed almost nothing. Some soldiers discovered that multiple thin layers worked better than single thick ones because they created more trapped air spaces. They would wear 2 or 3 light shirts rather than one heavy sweater, adjusting the system by adding or removing layers as conditions changed throughout the night. The outer layer had to provide wind protection while allowing moisture to escape. Soldiers learned to use ponchos, ground sheets, or captured enemy rain gear as wind barriers, but they had to be careful not to create a completely sealed system that would trap perspiration. The goal was to block wind while allowing enough air circulation to prevent dangerous moisture buildup. This balance required constant adjustment and monitoring throughout the night. Ground insulation became an engineering problem that soldiers solved through experimentation and shared knowledge. The standard technique involved creating a mattress of natural materials that would lift the entire body off the frozen ground. Pine boughs were ideal when available because they provided springy support while creating multiple air pockets underneath the sleeping soldier. Straw and dried grass worked well, but were harder to find in winter combat zones. Soldiers learned to gather these materials during daylight hours, storing them in sheltered areas where they would stay dry. When natural materials weren't available, soldiers became experts at scavenging artificial insulation. Cardboard could be layered to create effective ground barriers, though it had to be kept dry or it would compress and lose its insulating properties. Captured enemy equipment, damaged clothing, or even stuffed with spent ammunition casings could be repurposed as ground insulation. The key was creating a barrier at least 6 inches thick that would support the soldier's full body weight without compressing down to the frozen earth. Body heat sharing required careful coordination and trust between soldiers. The most effective technique involved 2 or 3 soldiers sleeping in a tight group, arranging their bodies so that each person's core was protected by the warmth of the others. This meant sleeping on their sides in a spoon formation, with soldiers taking turns being in the middle position where they received heat from both sides. The soldiers on the outside positions had to rotate periodically to ensure that no one spent the entire night exposed to the cold air. Blanket sharing followed specific techniques that maximized the effectiveness of limited bedding. Soldiers would overlap their individual blankets to create a larger insulated space, tucking the edges carefully to prevent heat loss, while ensuring that each person could exit quickly if needed for combat. Some units developed systems where soldiers would sew their blankets together temporarily using field repair kits, creating larger sleeping systems that could accommodate multiple soldiers while maintaining individual mobility. The buddy system extended beyond just sharing warmth to include active monitoring for cold injuries throughout the night. Soldiers would establish watch schedules where each person spent time checking on their sleeping partners, looking for signs of hypothermia or frostbite that the affected soldier might not recognize himself. These checks included monitoring breathing patterns, checking for confusion or slurred speech when waking soldiers briefly, and physically examining hands and feet for signs of frostbite. The buddy on watch would also be responsible for adjusting insulation, adding or removing layers as conditions changed, and ensuring that shared heat sources remained effective. Heating techniques had to balance warmth generation with tactical concealment. Small fires were sometimes possible in concealed positions, but soldiers learned that indirect heating was often more effective and safer than trying to warm themselves directly by flames. They would heat rocks, metal objects, or even ammunition that had been fired and was safe to handle, wrapping these improvised heating pads in cloth and placing them against core body areas or inside sleeping systems. These heated objects could provide warmth for several hours while producing no light or smoke that might reveal their position to enemy forces. Water bottles filled with heated water became another crucial tool when hot water was available from field kitchens or could be heated safely. Soldiers would place these improvised heating pads against major blood vessels at the wrists, neck, or groin, where they could warm the blood most effectively before it circulated throughout the body. This technique required careful temperature management to avoid burns, but when done correctly, it could maintain core body temperature throughout the night using minimal resources. A typical winter night for infantry soldiers began before sunset, when smart veterans started their preparation routine with the same methodical care they used to clean their weapons or check their ammunition. The transition from day to night in winter combat zones happened fast, and soldiers learned that waiting until darkness fell to prepare their sleeping area was a potentially fatal mistake. Temperature drops of 20 or 30 degrees could happen within an hour of sunset, turning a manageable situation into a survival emergency if soldiers weren't ready. The first step was always ground preparation, a process that required both engineering skill and tactical awareness. Soldiers would select their sleeping area based on protection from wind, concealment from enemy observation, and drainage to prevent water accumulation. They learned to avoid low spots where cold air would settle, but they also couldn't choose elevated positions that would expose them to enemy fire. The ideal location was a slight depression that provided protection without becoming a cold trap, preferably with natural wind breaks like rocks, trees, or destroyed buildings. Clearing the ground meant more than just removing snow. Soldiers had to break up any ice that had formed, remove stones or debris that could create pressure points during the night, and sometimes dig down to find ground that wasn't completely frozen. This work had to be done quietly using entrenching tools or improvised implements, since the sound of digging could travel long distances in cold air and reveal their position to enemy forces. The insulation layer came next, and experienced soldiers had developed specific techniques for creating the most effective barrier possible using available materials. They would lay materials in overlapping patterns, creating redundancy so that if one section compressed or shifted during the night, other areas would maintain insulation integrity. The thickness had to be consistent across the entire sleeping area because any thin spots would create cold bridges that could lead to localized hypothermia or frostbite. Equipment arrangement followed strict protocols that balanced warmth preservation with combat readiness. Weapons had to remain accessible, but couldn't be allowed to freeze, since ice could jam firing mechanisms or make metal components too cold to handle effectively. Soldiers would often sleep with their rifles inside their sleeping systems, using body heat to keep the mechanisms from freezing while ensuring they could grab their weapons instantly if needed. Ammunition was kept warm because cold temperatures could affect the reliability of cartridges, particularly in automatic weapons where feeding problems could prove fatal in combat. Personal gear required special attention in winter conditions. Boots had to be removed to prevent circulation problems, but they also had to be kept warm enough to put on quickly in an emergency. Many soldiers developed techniques for keeping their boots inside their sleeping systems or wrapping them in insulating materials that would prevent the leather from freezing solid. Wet socks were always changed before sleep, with damp socks either discarded or dried using body heat if replacement pairs weren't available. The sleeping arrangement within each small unit followed patterns that had been developed through trial and error over months of winter combat. The most experienced soldier would typically position himself where he could monitor the others and respond quickly to either enemy threats or medical emergencies. His experience meant he was most likely to recognize the early signs of hypothermia in his sleeping partners and most capable of taking effective action. New soldiers were placed in the center positions where shared body heat would keep them warmest, recognizing that their inexperience made them most vulnerable to cold injuries. Sleep cycles in winter combat were fundamentally different from normal rest patterns. Soldiers learned that trying to sleep for long periods in extreme cold was both dangerous and ineffective. Instead, they developed systems of rotating short sleep periods, typically lasting 2 to 3 hours maximum. This meant that soldiers were constantly cycling between sleep and wakefulness throughout the night, with each person taking turns at watch duty while others rested. The watch rotation served multiple purposes beyond traditional security. The soldier on duty was responsible for monitoring weather conditions, checking for signs of enemy activity, and most importantly, watching for cold injuries in his sleeping companions. This included regular checks of breathing patterns, brief wake-ups to check for confusion or hypothermia symptoms, and physical examination of exposed body parts for signs of frostbite. Watch duty also included maintaining any heat sources, adjusting insulation as conditions changed, and preparing for morning activities. Temperature management throughout the night required constant attention and adjustment. Soldiers learned to recognize the signs that their insulation system was failing, their body temperature was dropping, or their sleeping partners were in distress. They developed techniques for adding or removing layers without fully exposing themselves to cold air, sharing body heat more effectively when temperatures dropped unexpectedly, and using improvised heat sources safely in tactical situations. Morning brought its own set of critical challenges that could determine whether soldiers remained combat effective or became casualties. Frozen boots had to be thawed and dried, a process that required time and often heat sources that might not be available. Soldiers developed techniques for warming their boots using body heat, heated stones, or carefully managed small fires that wouldn't reveal their position. Wet or damp clothing had to be assessed and either dried or replaced, since starting the day with moisture in clothing would make the next night's survival even more difficult. Weapons maintenance in winter conditions required specific procedures that many soldiers learned only through experience. Ice could form in barrels, actions, and magazines overnight, making weapons unreliable or completely inoperable. Soldiers learned to check every component of their weapons each morning, clearing ice and moisture while ensuring that lubrication hadn't frozen solid. This process had to be completed quickly and quietly, since dawn was often when enemy forces launched attacks against positions they had observed during the night. Medical checks became a crucial part of the morning routine, as cold injuries often weren't apparent until soldiers tried to move and function normally. Frostbite could occur without pain, particularly in extremities where circulation was reduced by cold temperatures. Soldiers learned to examine each other systematically, looking for the telltale signs of cold injury: skin that was white, waxy, or unusually red, areas that lacked sensation, or digits that were stiff and difficult to move. Early detection and treatment could prevent minor cold injuries from becoming permanent disabilities. The psychological preparation for another day of combat after a night of survival in extreme conditions was perhaps the most challenging aspect of winter warfare. Soldiers had to transition from survival mode to combat readiness while dealing with the physical and mental stress of having barely survived the night. This required mental discipline and unit cohesion that went far beyond normal military training, as soldiers had to support each other through conditions that would break individuals operating alone. These techniques, refined through desperate necessity and paid for with countless casualties, proved that humans could survive and fight effectively in conditions that seemed impossible. The knowledge that kept soldiers alive through brutal winter nights wasn't just about individual survival. It was about maintaining unit effectiveness, ensuring that squads and platoons could continue to function as fighting forces even after months of winter warfare. A unit that mastered these techniques gained a tactical advantage that could determine the outcome of battles and ultimately, the course of the war itself.